welcome everyone to these AKC conversations. Today we have a very special conversation, special guest, the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas is joining us from her home in Maryland. Kelly is the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School and Professor of Theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Dean Douglas is a pioneering voice addressing sexual issues in relation to the Black religious community and an advocate for equal rights for LGBTQ persons. Her first book was The Black Christ, a portrait of Jesus' significance for the Black community, from early slave testimonies to the civil rights and Black power movements. This was followed by another groundbreaking book, Sexuality and the Black Church, a Womanist Perspective, published in 1999, which addressed the issue of homophobia within Black church communities. Her latest book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, examines the challenges of a stand your ground culture for the Black church. And she has another book coming out in autumn this year that's called Resurrection Hope, a Future Where Black Lives Matter. So Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean Douglas, welcome to King's. We're just so delighted to have you with us to have this conversation on leadership. The conversation is going to be conducted by the Dean of Kings, Ellen Clark-King, who you already know. So I'm going to hand over now to Ellen to begin the conversation. But I'm so glad you're here to speak with us, Kelly.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, Claire, for the introduction, and welcome, Kelly. It's a delight to have this time with you. And Claire told us a bit about sort of where you are now and what you're doing now. Could you tell us something of the journey that you had to get to that place?
So do you want the long version or the abbreviated version? First of all, what a privilege to be in conversation with you. And so thank you for this privilege and congratulations on your new appointment as Dean of King's College. So I'll give you the abbreviated version, but I do have to start back to a time of my growing up, because that would shape the whole trajectory in so many ways of what I now perceive as my call, and sort of got me here. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is in the Midwest of our country. And Dayton was then and remains a very segregated city. And so in Dayton, that when they spoke of the west side of Dayton, that's where Black people lived, and everything else was where white people live. And at that time, Dayton was very Black and white. And so you had to go through the so-called inner city of Dayton to get to downtown, the center of Dayton. So I remember one day, it was a cloudy, rainy, kind of cold evening. And I was riding in the car with my parents. I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I was in the back seat and I was looking out of the window. And we came to a stoplight. And as I looked out the window, I saw coming across the street on this rainy, cold day, 2 children that in my 8-year-old mind looked about my age. And it was a little girl and a little boy, and I imagined them to be brother and sister, but they weren't dressed properly for the weather. Mm-hmm. And so again, in my imagination, these children were underprivileged, as I would say now. And I remember that tears began to stream down my face. And I made a silent vow to myself as an 8-year-old that I would one day come back to get those children, because I just did not feel that any children should have to live the kind of life that I imagined they were living. And so from that point on, well, initially I thought I was going to become a teacher, elementary school teacher, and that somehow education and through that route I could rescue those children. As a little kid, I thought that I would grow older, they would stay young, and I could go back and find those children. But the significant thing here is that that story never left me. And it shaped me. And I have continued to hold myself accountable to those children. And so I sought ways, tried to discern ways, in essence, to get back to those children. And I always connected very early on, before I even knew what the word theology was. I connected those children to the little baby Jesus born in a manger. And again, I would cry when we would sing that song, Born in a Little Child of Bethlehem, or Born in a Manger. And I connected those two realities. And so somehow I knew it would come through that way, though I took all kind of ups and downs and doubts of faith before I got there. But that shaped my journey. And in many ways, that's how I have arrived where I am now, always seeking ways to get back to those children, which for me has meant trying to foster, to create a world that is reflective of the abundant life that is God's justice that God offers us all.
That's a really powerful origin story, and amazing how those sort of childhood encounters can really sort of frame the pathway ahead. Tell us a bit more about sort of some of the challenges that you've faced in sort of getting to a place where you have some influence in hopefully making the world a better place for children like these, and maybe some of the challenges that you still face in that place.
Yeah, and you know, and the question is some sort of influence, and I always try to say that in whatever small garden of the world that God has placed us in, you know, it is our job to in some way try to nurture a glimpse, at least, of God's more just future. And so, but here I am, of course, as a woman and a Black woman, and I know you can tell the stories of what it means to be a woman in leadership in a patriarchal world. And for me, in a racialized patriarchy, a white supremacist patriarchy. And so, of course, that means all along the way, just even in simply growing up, you're always sort of going against the odds, fighting against the odds of the stereotypes. So and just, you know, those fighting against the odds, they only transform themselves. They don't go away as you move through and through success, whatever that may look like. And so at this stage, it remains the case that in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways, people question my ability, my intelligence, my right, my voice, the authenticity of my voice. I dare you as a Black woman, or, you know, always checking whether or not the truth of what one has to say, checking it against this sort of epistemology, as I always say, of white knowing. Everything is through this white gaze, and it's tested through that. And so even as I have come into this position as Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union, you know, people question my credentials and the way in which they will do that subtly or sometimes not so subtly. I knew what it felt like when our former occupant of the White House questioned the authenticity of President Obama's birth. So I felt like people were putting me to the test in that regard, and they did, or they approach you, and I'm sure, Ellen, you know this, in ways that you know they would never, ever approach a white male who's set in this position. And so the task for me, which I learned very young, because it's how, parents of Black children have to have many conversations and provide them with many tools. But one of the conversations and one of the tools is about never allowing yourself to be defined by the way in which the world sees you.
Yeah.
Right. And not to live into that. That to me is to not allow yourself to be held captive to the original sin of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And you're held captive by that when you find yourself always defending against that and apologetic to that. And the way to be freed from that is just to move forward with your vision and in utter defiance of that, as if, okay, like that has no control over my life. That's not who I am. And if you want to stay held captive to that, shame on you, and watch out, because something's gonna happen and you're gonna be, the dead will bury the dead. And so that's really, Ellen, the way in which I've dealt with it for the most part. It's not to act like it's not there, but to not let it define me, and to go on and to be accountable to God's more just future, even as I'm accountable to those, my forebears, my foremothers, who paved the way for me to be here, and not to allow myself to be held captive to the white supremacist sin of others. Now, even as I said, I'll say one last thing and then I'll shut up on this. That's not to say, as you know, that there are times when enough is enough. Yeah. And it has to be confronted and called out directly for what it is. But we know for our own health, we make the decisions of when we are going to fight those battles or let them go.
Yeah. And I think sort of knowing when to fight, like you say, is so important. And also that being able not to internalize those outward projections that are being put on you, and to somehow be able to be undefended in your leadership, so that you can set the agenda you want, rather than having to react to the other people's agenda all the time.
No, that's so well said. Because that's what happens, isn't it? That, you find yourself always reacting to their agenda, and that's indeed the intent. And yeah. You don't get about doing the work that you feel you're called to do, and setting a whole new agenda and living into a whole new vision. So yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's another way of restricting leadership to where leadership has traditionally belonged, in white male hands. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So that you become a representation, but not a new voice and not a new vision. Right?
Yeah.
And changing systems and structures.
Yeah. I'm building on from that. What do you see as the most important changes that need to be made in both sort of the way people lead in the church or outside the church, and how people get put into or allowed to lead or selected for positions of leadership?
Yeah, because that, it's a cycle, isn't it? Yeah. It's almost a catch-22, because if we even are simply talking about the institutions within our Anglican communion, and we have to talk about the way in which sin is systemic and structural, so that it indeed functions the way it's supposed to function. It's no accident that you were the first woman in all of these many centuries to lead King's College. The system has functioned the way it's supposed to function by not having a woman. Mm-hmm. It is no accident that I'm the first Black person to lead an Episcopal seminary in the history of Episcopal seminaries in our country. When someone told me that, I said, can't be. But then I thought, well, no, can be. Systems and structures have functioned the way in which they're supposed to function. And so that means, for me, part of, leadership, or our leadership period, I think for me, should be defined by being accountable, not to the way things are, but accountable to the way things are supposed to be, to God's indeed more just future. And so that's what faith is all about, partnering with God, right? To mend the world and foster the future that God promises us all. So what does that mean, sort of look like in practical terms? It seems to me that first we have to create the kind of space that allows for people to open up their creative imagination of what justice looks like. And so that leadership, to me, when we think of sort of male white supremacist leadership, it's hierarchical, right? And leadership means pulling people somewhere or dominating people, and leadership gets confused with this sense of authority that is authoritarian, and that amounts to one voice, being the voice that's heard. No, I mean, it means the buck stops with me, but it means that I give space to the variety of voices that can bring a variety of perspectives to what that just future looks like, and that the institutions in which we have been called to these roles of leadership become a glimpse of that. More just future is, for seminary, means being a seed bed to nurture that, to nurture the kind of transformational leadership that will go out into the world, even as we try to reflect that, at least be a glimpse of what that looks like, which means being a glimpse of a place that the foundation is the respect for the sacred humanity of everybody who has breath or has ever had breath. Leadership for me also means not having all of the right answers. In fact, it's not about having the answers. It's about helping us to develop the right questions, a different set of questions, even if we don't come to the answers, right? At least questioning and pushing forward until we get to a better place. It's about falling upwards, if you will. We're gonna fall, but fall upwards, fall forward. And so leadership to me is about creating the space that allows people to take the risk to be vulnerable, to create a better, not an improved present, but a different future that will have that we will have a glimpse of in the present.
I love the expansiveness of the vision of leadership as you talk about it, and its sort of inclusion and raising up voices. And one thing I was wondering about, having heard the title of your new book that's coming out in the autumn, what sort of glimpse do you have of that sort of better future? What sort of, tiny part of that vision can you see, and are you hoping that we will reach towards?
Yeah, well, it is a vision for me where Black lives will matter. So what does that mean and look like for me? One of the things that is interesting in this country, that when the mantra Black Lives Matter emerged, the response was not, yes, they matter, but the response was, all lives matter. As if to suggest, first of all, that first it became impossible for people to say that Black Lives Matter. What does that suggest? And even more than that, it was impossible for people to allow Black lives to signal, to symbolize all of humanity. There is a deep narrative of anti-Blackness, not only in this country, but globally, that allows that causes people to have this instinctive response to the Black body. In this country, that instinctive response is a response of calling police on Black people who are going about their daily activities, you know, and you were in this country long enough to know what that looks like, you know. So we have all these mantras: driving while Black, someone calls the police on you; barbecuing while Black, someone calls the police on you; bird watching while Black. I mean, can you imagine? He's a bird watcher. Bird watching while Black, and someone calls the police on you. And more often than not, those calls end up in the fatality of a Black person in a Black life, vis-a-vis a George Floyd or an Elijah McClain or a Trayvon Martin or a Breonna Taylor or a Atiana Jefferson, and the list can go on. So for me, that future where Black lives will matter is a future where we change these wineskins of white supremacy that cannot even contain the imagination of a future where all life is seen as sacred. Where, you know, I like to say, quoting from scripture, Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first. It's not because there's a reversal of fortunes. It's because the first are last, the last are first. There is no inequality. Everyone is seen as equal and treated as such. One of the measures of that in our country that people have heard a lot about is what happens in terms of the way in which Black bodies have been policed, right? And so it seems to me that one of the measures of a future where Black lives will matter is where we are no longer policing communities, but fostering and building safe communities. And these safe communities are just communities. Too many Black lives are trapped in the crucifying realities of poverty which spells death, and the limited opportunities. And people are always acting shocked when there are an inordinate amount of homicides in these communities that are trapped in poverty. Well, it's surprising when there's a flourishing a lot of life. So because these communities foster death, not life. And so we have to begin to create safe communities. There's a discussion of reparations. Reparations, yes, I do believe that there have to be reparations, but not simply the reparations that fill the breach between the present that is caused by the legacy of the past that was slavery, but there has to be the kind of reparations that fill the breach between our unjust present and God's just future. That means creating just communities. That means doing something about the systems and the structures, the policies and the politics that foster crucifying realities in which Black people are disproportionately trapped within. So I could go on and on about the details of what that looks like, but the bottom line to me is that a future where Black lives matter is a future where we can see the sacredness of God through those lives that are Black. And right now, we aren't able to do that in this country.
Yeah, and not just in the States. I mean, having lived in Canada for quite a while and in the UK, there's plenty enough racism to go round. I'm sorry and sad to say.
Oh yeah, that's why the Black Lives Matter protests in this country this summer erupted globally.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of my sort of Bible sort of keynotes is, I've come that they may have life and have it abundantly. And it seems that we sort of work out of this scarcity model in which there's only so much honor, so much worth to be given, and we're only going to give that to this, traditional white group of people. And for a future where we can, a present where we can sort of see the abundance of God's love and the abundance of humanity's ability to image and icon and carry God. But
yeah, that's right. And the abundance of God's creation, right? And all forms of that creation. And so you're right, we've gotten into this scarcity model, and the belief that there's not even enough natural resources to go around. No, there are. And this scarcity of model of the way in which we view creation. We view God's human creation as well as all of creation, but God's human creation through this binary lens. God's created reality is not binary in any way, shape, or form. And so we have not allowed ourselves to appreciate that. The vastness, the richness, and so doing have betrayed our own creation. And so I always say that, you know what, borrowing from Paul Tillich's words, the courage to be, that we have to have the courage to be ourselves. That is, to be who God created us to be. Sacred creations, nothing more, nothing less, and to create a world where we can all live into that. My younger sister always likes to say that we are all dressed up dirt. We are, and I say that's a pretty darn good thing to be. And so, you know, those people who live into the privileges and the entitlements of the sin that is white supremacy, those people are the people who have most betrayed their sacred humanity.
Yeah.
And until they recognize that, and as James Baldwin says, go back and ask themselves, what is the price of the ticket we have paid to be white? And until they ask themselves that, they will not be freed from that sin that is whiteness. And hence our world will not be free from the original sin that is the captivity to this kind of white supremacy that betrays the sacred creation of who we are, is dust, is dressed up dust.
One of the things that gives me hope, and one of the joys of being Dean of Kings, is seeing some of the sort of young leaders who are coming up and with a passion for changing the world and an ability to see the world differently, not in these binary sort of ways. Are there things that you're seeing in the next generation of leaders that's encouraging you?
Just what you said, you know, and isn't that one of the really privileges of being deans of these educational institutions and seeing a different generation come through, not warped by the vision of our generation, and seeing possibilities beyond even what we could have imagined as possible. And a generation that has claimed and you see this at Union. I mean, Union is interfaith and a very diverse collective of God's creation. And what gives me hope, and you see it all the time across the globe, a generation of people who have claimed and are living into the uniqueness in the variety of ways in which they are a unique creation of God's, that defies the binaries of who they're supposed to be. That I laugh at that. It's like God's last laugh, which is, you know, and it's like, yes, because laughter is pointing to the absurdity between what's supposed to be and what is. And I laugh at that because they are a glimpse of what's supposed to be. And then they come into these spaces and into the classroom. And that's why I say that if our leadership is true leadership, fostering a more just future, we have to open up the space for them to be, right? And to live in. I always say to people, find your voice. Don't mimic anybody else's voice, and certainly not mine, but nobody else's voice. Find your voice, because it is in finding their voice and then letting it out into the world that's where the hope is. So yeah, it energizes me, and it is what gives me hope. And if if and when, and it will hopefully never happen, you no longer see that energy from the future generation, the next generation. That's when we fall into the despair of no hope. But that's what gives me hope. When I say you, in my greatest moment of despair during this past summer of Black death, and that was not only the Black death from the police brutality that just seems ever present in Black life in this country, but the Black death that was exacerbated by COVID. As we like to say, these two pandemics came together, the pandemic of white supremacy and the pandemic that is COVID came together to make Black life more susceptible to the virus that is COVID. And I was in this deep moment of despair. And this said, you know, maybe God, we got it wrong. You know, maybe as a theologian said a few decades ago, William Jones, maybe God is a white racist. Maybe the Afro-pessimists are right. But then I went, in this moment, I was moved to go down to the protest in Washington, D.C. On Black Lives Matter Plaza, and to see that sea of mostly people much younger than me, of all stripes, out there protesting in a variety of ways in which they found a protest, some singing, some with signs, some shouting, some drumming, all there, all protesting that Black lives mattered, steps away from a White House that had given birth to the vision to make America great again. I laughed, and that's where I found once again my hope and saw a glimpse of God's future.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of my most worshipful moments over the summer was in San Francisco in a Black Lives Matter protest, which was a Take the Knee protest, sort of kneeling for George Floyd. And it was one of the, having not been able to worship in a church for months by that stage, there was a real sense for me of this is where the worship is, this is where God is active and present in God's people.
That's right. That's right.
So if you had any sort of suggestions, words of wisdom for sort of the next generation of leaders coming up, and you've told us some of them already, claim your voice, don't try and be like somebody else, be yourself. Is there anything else that you would want to say to them?
Yeah, but you know, that's it to me, to find that piece of yourself that uniquely reflects the image of God, and claim it and find a way to cast it out into the world. And our task as leaders is to help people to do that and to provide them the space to explore it.
Kelly, it's been wonderful having this conversation with you. I feel energized and hopeful, and I'm so grateful to you for giving this time to Kings. Thank you for this. Thank you for all you're doing in the leadership of the Episcopal Church and well beyond that. And thank you for being you and having lived into your own gift of who you are and your own gift of leadership. Thank you.
I am humbled by that. And I thank you for this conversation that I hope for us is a continuing conversation.
Agreed.